And what I'm going to share with you is how this came about, how the countries and the empires and the various countries argued amongst themselves in order to get to this agreement. But crucially, I'm going to talk about what does this mean for Israeli politics relating to territory and borders of the modern state of Israel, and what does it mean for what I call right-wing Zionism and left-wing Zionism, and what impact does that have on the way that we as a diaspora support the state of Israel. So there's a lot that's going to be dealt with here. But effectively, this is the story of a treaty signed 100 years ago, the celebration of which was, before this virus started, about to start, and which tells us a great deal about the current challenges which face the relationship between our diaspora and the state of Israel. Now, so much of the basis, the modern basis for the state of Israel, was forged in the midst of the aftermath of World War I. And as I said, your view of the importance of the San Remo Conference Declaration indicates your likely attitude to Israeli territorial issues and to Israel's relations with the Palestinians. So just a reminder that in 1917, in the midst of World War I, the British government looked to the future and chose to recognize the longing of the Jewish people to re-establish their national homeland in the state of Israel. So let's recap a little bit about the Balfour Declaration. If you remember, I gave a talk at Coffee and Conversation 3 years ago about the Balfour Declaration, which was entered into on the 2nd of November of 1917. Now, the Balfour Declaration, crucially, was a political statement which had no legal authority. Indeed, it wasn't an international declaration. It was purely a British government statement. But nonetheless, it was a major turning point in the history of the Jewish people, for the first time giving the Jewish people their future hope of eventually fulfilling their everlasting longing to return to their ancient Holy Land. Now, what the Balfour Declaration accomplished was to raise the profile internationally of the need for the Jewish people, a stateless people, to have a national home to which they could return. So of real significance was the official recognition in that declaration of the historic, religious and cultural links of the Jews to the land of their forefathers, the land that had come to be known under the Greeks and the Romans as Palestine. Just before we move on to the San Remo Declaration, I want to focus on how the Balfour Declaration was received by religious Zionists. We know that the wider community celebrated the Balfour Declaration in November 1917 by holding a major community gathering at the London Opera House in London. There was a special edition of the Jewish Chronicle, but the religious community, which had struggled to grasp the Zionist movement that had developed since 1897, had a real champion in Rav Kook. And Rav Kook became a major Torah figure in the state of Israel when it was set up. Now, he was living in England at the time, and he was a passionate advocate for the Balfour Declaration. He would describe the long years of struggle during World War I for the Balfour Declaration as a revelation of the hand of God. Now, this represented remarkable religious support for the work that Chaim Weizmann and all the Zionists had been doing for many, many years. And Rav Kook, once he received news of the declaration in November of 1917, wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, who had been, if you remember, the recipient of the Balfour Declaration from the government. He wrote this letter on the 8th of November 1917, and it was as follows. Let me read it to you. He said, "I bless his honor from the depths of my heart with a faithful blessing. May he become even more steadfast in the holy task of building our people in our beloved land. And this great privilege of the proclamation of this first step in the redemption of Israel will remain true for you to soon see our aspiration fulfilled in all of its glory, when Judah and Israel dwell safely in their land, and the tribe lost in Assyria, the tribe of our kingdom, will become a bastion of long-lasting peace for all nations, as told by the trustworthy word of God at the hand of his holy prophets." He described the British realm as, by divine providence, it fell upon her role to be at the head of this holy service of building the holy nation in the Holy Land. To Rav Kook's son, he wrote, "Truly great things for our future are being done here in England. It's very hard to write in clear lines about the things happening before our eyes. The acts are so wondrous to the point where the eye dims from looking and the ears from all the hearing and the listening." And later, he would reflect on this period, 1917 to 1923, as saying, "Taken individually, each event may be explained in a rational manner, but when they are viewed together, we may discern a wondrous chain of complementary links created and guided by a divine hand." The chief rabbi at the time, Chief Rabbi Hertz, was also a passionate Zionist. Some months earlier in 1917, he'd pinned his colours firmly to the Zionist mast in a letter to the Times. He wrote to the government just before the Balfour Declaration was issued to issue his support, and he said the following: "It is with feelings of the profoundest gratification that I learn of the intention of His Majesty's government to lend its powerful support to the re-establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It will mark an epoch in Jewish history. To millions of my brethren throughout the world, it will mean the realization of Israel's undying hope for a restoration, a hope that has been the spiritual lodestar of Israel's wanderings for the last 1800 years." So the Balfour Declaration is no doubt a very important moment. As I said earlier, in the midst of World War I, in November 1917, the British government had a concern for the Jewish home in Palestine. And it was a political decision, but crucially, it had no legal validity. In fact, in 1917, there was no actual country named Palestine. It was all part of the Ottoman Empire, and that was divided into districts. And so, after the Balfour Declaration, the war came to an end. And it took another year and 7 days from the Balfour Declaration, and 9 days for the war to end on the 11th of November 1918. What happened then, and how we moved towards the San Remo Declaration, was that the victorious Allied powers had to then turn to the carve-up of the defeated Ottoman Empire. And it was this process that led to a range of high-level diplomatic and imperial rows. Now, despite the British government's Balfour Declaration, there were designs on the part of the nation of France on part of the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And so the decision about how to carve up the Ottoman Empire was taken up by something called the Supreme Council of the principal Allied and associated powers. They were Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. The first peace conference was held in Paris in 1919, an attempt with all sorts of issues relating to Germany and to the defeated Ottoman Empire. The issue became very complex because at the Paris Peace Conference, submissions for territorial claims over what we now know as the Middle East, what was the Ottoman Empire, were presented by both Arab and Jewish delegations, as well as that empire seeking to be apportioned out amongst the victorious powers. And so the Paris Peace Conference, which was the first attempt to try and bring some order to the post-war world, broke up without any form of agreement relating to the Middle East. Now, what did happen at the Paris Peace Conference, and this factored into the progression of the events that we'll be discussing in a moment, was the establishment of the League of Nations, which, in Article 22 of its covenant, provided for the setting up of what it called a mandate system in trust for the old Ottoman territories. Now, the League of Nations was the first example of formal international cooperation. It became eventually the United Nations, but that was established in principle at the Peace Conference in 1919. Now, for the Zionists, who had had their victory in some part with the Balfour Declaration, led by Chaim Weizmann. What they needed to now do was to try and convert the political Balfour Declaration into a legally binding commitment to the establishment of a Jewish home. But more than a year was to pass before a final decision was reached as to the future of Palestine. Now, this delay to the holding up of what would become a peace treaty with Turkey was the ambiguous attitude of the United States. Under Woodrow Wilson, they were at first willing to be internationalist and play a part in the post-war settlement, and then under domestic pressure, the United States withdrew. And so it was agreed between Great Britain, France, and Italy that they had to go forward without the USA. And so an inter-allied conference opened in London in February of 1920, and the Turkish peace treaty began to take shape. Now, within the British government, a couple of things had happened. Lloyd George was still the Prime Minister, but Arthur Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary and had issued the Balfour Declaration, had been replaced as Foreign Secretary by Lord Curzon. And it was Lord Curzon who now represented the British government at the two conferences. At the London conference, Great Britain was to make a claim that it should have a nation's mandate for Palestine. And they wanted to take responsibility for giving legal effect to the Balfour Declaration, and then to press for formal endorsement by the principal Allied powers in the formulation of the Turkish peace treaty. So the Zionists were able to advance their case at the Paris Peace Conference in February. So what made things quite difficult at this Paris Peace Conference was the view of the government of France, which was later to be strongly pressed, that they believed that there could be no reference in any of the treaties to the Balfour Declaration, since this had only been a unilateral announcement by Great Britain and it didn't bind her allies. So on this point, the French government were to fight their main battle 2 months later at the San Remo conference. I'll get to that in a moment. It's quite difficult working out what happened when, with conferences in London, in Paris and London and San Remo. But the fight that was to take place at the San Remo conference was effectively between the British, who wanted the Balfour Declaration included in the legally binding mandate that they would have for Palestine, and the French, who were to fight against that. Now, just going back a little bit to the London conference, there was no decision about Palestine. But as I said earlier, there was a clear agreement that the mandate for Palestine would be assigned to Great Britain. So Great Britain was in the driving seat for what would happen in relation to Palestine. And there is some quite important wording in the London conference that we come back to a little bit later, because there was a draft peace treaty agreed, circulated with Turkey. And the following paragraph within it was approved at the London conference to be ratified a little bit later on. So this wording that I'm about to read out was agreed on the February 21st of 1920. And it said the following: Palestine, the boundaries to be defined in accordance with its ancient limits of Dan to Beersheba, should be under British mandate. Now, this rather expansive wording of the boundaries of Palestine is important to remember when I come back to set out some of the legal arguments a little bit later. So do remember that there seemed to be a draft agreement that the boundaries of Palestine should be from Dan to Beersheba, which is what we would recognize as the biblical boundaries of the land of Israel as set out in the book of Devarim. So what was the San Remo conference? Let's talk about that now and lead to what the declaration was. So having had the Paris conference and the London conference, the final consideration of the peace treaty with Turkey was reserved for a further conference to be held in Italy. Now the choice fell upon San Remo, where it was agreed that a meeting conducted, by the way, in full dress, so dress suits, of the Allied Supreme Council opened on the 18th of April 1920. The British delegation was led by the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon. Lord Balfour, was not a member, but he was invited along for consultation. The Zionists, Chaim Weizmann and Nachum Sokolov attended the conference. Now, it's very important to see what the British went into the San Remo conference with. Their proposal was as follows, and you can begin to see from this how the current makeup of the Middle East was developed. Firstly, they proposed that there should be a completely independent state of Syria with the Emir Faisal as its sovereign. Secondly, Western Syria, which we now know as Lebanon, was to be administered by France under a League of Nations mandate. Thirdly, that Palestine should be administered by Great Britain under a League mandate, and in their wording, the mandate to embody provisions relating to the Jewish national home, which should be satisfactory to the Zionists. You can see for this how well the Zionists had actually inculcated their arguments into British government foreign policy. They proposed that there should be an independent Hijaz under the sovereignty of King Hussein. That was to become eventually the state of Transjordan. And lastly, Mesopotamia, what we now know as Iraq, should be under British administration and, if desired, under an Arab sovereign. So those were the British proposals on the first day of the San Remo conference. Now, the San Remo conference spent its first couple of days discussing everything in there other than Palestine. And the question of Palestine was not actually reached until 6 days after the start of the conference on the 24th of April 1920. And in the end, the battle, the political battle and the diplomatic battle was joined on this issue, a demand by the French government for a special regime for the custody of the holy places and for the protection of the rights of religious communities. Now, the French, remember, the French had had some designs themselves on having the mandate for Palestine. So they were still trying to put points forward that might give their position some form of protection. What they said was that these matters, so the custody of the holy places and the protection of the rights of religious communities, they proposed that they should be reserved for a special inter-allied commission appointed by the League of Nations and to be consisting of representatives of the religious bodies. There was a long discussion about this, and as with all diplomatic treaties, they ended with a compromise. Compromise was this: on the understanding that France would not press for any special privileges for itself, Lloyd George agreed that the mandatory, that's Great Britain, would appoint a special commission to deal with all questions and claims relating to the different religious communities. In return for this concession with which the French had to content themselves, Lloyd George invited the French to agree that the treaty should incorporate the Balfour Declaration. Now, the French began to inch towards accepting this compromise, but they still had one card to play, because they attached great importance to including in the treaty wording to protect the political rights of the existing non-Jewish communities, and adding this to the wording from the Balfour Declaration, which protected the civil rights of those communities. So they said that the political as well as the civil rights of non-Jewish communities should be expressly safeguarded. Now, this last move, a diversion many have described it, led nowhere. French lost on this point, and all they got was an undertaking by the mandatory power to the effect that nothing in the mandate would involve the surrender of rights hitherto enjoyed by non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And so, the mandate for Palestine was entrusted to Great Britain, described as a sacred trust of civilization in respect of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, the argument that is made, and I'll come to the significance of this later, is that this San Remo declaration became a binding resolution with all the full force of international law. So let me read the terms of the San Remo Declaration. It was agreed on the 25th of April 1920, and the Supreme Council agreed this. In relation to Palestine, it provided that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on the 2nd of November 1917 by the British government and adopted by the other Allied powers in favour of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So, crucial fact here, which I will come back to in a moment, there was no reference in the treaty to the political rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So, that's the historical basis for this. Now we start to get editorial, because like all agreements and like all documents, people begin to interpret this in ways that will suit their own particular arguments. And I want to set up the bit of the discussion that I'd be interested in your views on just for the next few moments, because I believe that the way that you interpret the San Remo Declaration determines politically your attitude to issues relating to the territorial boundaries and of the State of Israel and relations with the Palestinians. And I'll explain why. So I, as a layman and not even a historian, but somebody whose politics tends to be to the center of the Israeli political spectrum, I regard the San Remo Conference as just one step along the way to the establishment of the modern State of Israel. The order was the Balfour Declaration, San Remo Conference giving legal effect, the carving out of Transjordan, which reduced the borders of the State of Israel, then Arab-Israeli unrest, the 1947 UN General Assembly resolution, the 1948 Declaration of Independence, the War of Independence, the 1949 armistice, the 1967 Six-Day War. There is an argument on the left and the center that the political debate within Israel is formed by that series of events, which forms the underpinning of the legal and political basis of our modern discussions relating to the boundaries of Israel and the relations with the Palestinians. But what I call the legal Zionists, so the Zionists that come from that legal background, slightly more right-wing Zionists, or the Greater Israel Zionists, see the San Remo Declaration as a major legal development which governs the borders of modern Israel and, crucially, the legal status of Jerusalem. Now, there is no question that the legal decision made in San Remo was a watershed moment in the history of the Jewish people. Chaim Weizmann, who had been a delegate at the San Remo Conference, he was president of the newly formed Zionist organization, and as we know, was later to become the first president of the State of Israel, said as follows: recognition of our rights in Palestine is embodied in the treaty with Turkey and has become part of international law. This is the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement, and it is perhaps no exaggeration to say in the whole history of our people since the exile. To the Zionist Organization of America, the San Remo Resolution crowns the British Balfour Declaration by enacting it as part of the law of nations of the world. Now, there is a lawyer whom I've met and spent some time with, a French lawyer whose name is Jacques Gauthier, who advocates a very, very hardline legal argument based around the San Remo Conference. I'm going to try and do it justice. I probably won't do it justice, and any lawyers listening will see that there is, I've not probably brought out the full complexity of the argument. So he says that the San Remo Conference was the final hearing of what he calls a world court, council of the 5 leading nations and the victors of World War I. The case before the court began at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where both the Jews and Arabs in the Middle East submitted claims to the council to obtain independence and control of various territories. And Gautier himself describes the San Remo Conference as the key defining moment in history on the issue of title to State of Israel and crucially to Jerusalem. His argument was that the San Remo leaders agreed to all of the Jewish representatives' requests. And again, he refers to the relevant resolution, and he says that in the preamble, the high contracting parties agreed to entrust the administration of Palestine within such boundaries as may be determined by the principal Allied powers to a mandatory authority that will be responsible for putting into effect the Balfour Declaration in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So the argument is that that point that I raised earlier about the wording coming out of the London Conference about the boundaries of the state of Palestine, his argument is that those boundaries from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, all of that area was now included in legally binding international law from the League of Nations relating to the mandate for Palestine to be administered by Great Britain. And his argument too is, so that the first argument is about boundaries. And so the argument is that the entirety of what is now the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem was therefore under international law expressly decreed to be included in the mandate for Palestine to be administered by Great Britain. Second point is the specific fact that there is no reference to political rights for the Arab communities is also significant. He says that that was deliberate and that therefore the political rights that exist within the mandate for Palestine relate to the Jews, not to the Arabs. You can see why this is quite a right-wing discussion and why it's been adopted by right-wing parts of the Zionist movement and of Israeli politics, as well as the Greater Israel type Zionists, because their argument is that it defines the territory and it also undermines the political claims of the Palestinians to anything within that area. And so it's a very, very significant right-wing point because it talks about only Jewish rights, and it is rather, if you look at it, quite dismissive of the rights of non-Jewish communities. So the main argument, and Jean Gautier is one of the lawyers who carries some weight, not a great deal of weight, others have articulated his arguments in a different way, is as follows. He argues that a non-broken series of treaties and resolutions laid out by the San Remo Resolution, the League of Nations, and then the United Nations gives the Jewish people legal title to all of the land that was set out in there, including Jerusalem. And so his argument is that that started at the San Remo Conference, and that was the first part of the International Legal Declaration. In fact, San Remo was the first time that the Jewish historical right to the land of Israel was recognized in any international treaty. And so there were various other treaties that followed after that, including in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, where although changes were made to various elements of it, and because of the treaty that agreed to the carving out of Transjordan to create the state of that was Transjordan and now the Kingdom of Jordan, still there was no impact on the remainder of the legal document and the territorial rights of the Jewish people. And so in their argument, the mandate for Palestine was stronger than the declaration by the insertion of the fundamental principle that Palestine should be reconstituted as the national home of the Jewish people. And the people who follow this line of argument argue as follows. They say that the primary objective of Great Britain's mandate over Palestine was to provide a national home for the Jewish people, whether in Palestine already or dispersed worldwide. And it dismisses the entitlement of Arab communities and argues that the other decisions taken at the San Remo conference relating to territories were what was intended for Arab communities, and that when Britain carved out the nation of the Kingdom of Transjordan, that similarly was intended to address Arab political, legal, and religious rights. So, in a word, the primary foundations in international law for the arguments about the legal claims based on historic rights or historic title of the Jewish people in respect of Palestine are the San Remo Declaration of April 1920, it was approved in July 1922 in the Mandate for Palestine, approved by the Council of the League of Nations, and then the Covenant of the League of Nations itself. And as I say, that argument is that the whole idea of San Remo was to give effect to the Jewish rights to the land of Israel. So that is what I call the slightly right-wing, slightly legal, slightly greater Israel Zionist argument relating to the ownership and entitlement to land. Now, for me, therefore, your attitude to the San Remo Declaration does sort of determine where you sit on the spectrum of political views relating to the boundaries of Israel, the borders of Israel, and relations with Palestinians. So that is what I describe the slightly right-wing argument to the right of Israeli politics. To the center and the left, there's lots of talk of the two-state solution. Two-state solution, and how does the San Remo Declaration allow coexist or live side by side with the two-state solution? I believe, having worked in the Jewish community for 7 years, that there is what I call a loose but quite sustainable consensus around a two-state solution. The two-state solution, just as a reminder, is based on the Oslo Accords of 1993, where agreement was reached between Israel and the Palestinians, brokered by the United States, for there to be the creation of Palestinian administration in the West Bank and Gaza, with a view to there being final status negotiations, which would lead to the creation of two states side by side, a Jewish state of Israel and a state of Palestine, with final status negotiations on Jerusalem. Now, having worked across the community for as long as I have, I know that this consensus that there should be a two-state solution holds together many parts of the British and worldwide political establishment. For example, two-state solution remains the official policy of the British government, the Labour Party, the Scottish National Party, the European Union, and governments throughout the world. So even though you might argue that the prospects of there being a two-state solution are diminishing, that still remains the agreed policy, international policy in relation to Palestine of our own government, our own political parties, and of a number of trade unions, universities, and so on. We are able to hold on to a consensus around Israel, provided that people accept that there is a prospect of there being a two-state solution. Now, that consensus, it's worried me for quite some time, is coming under threat because of what would be described as a drift to the right in Israeli and United States politics in relation to the Israel and Palestinian question. And you can see that now. We've now had 3 elections in Israel since I started thinking about giving this talk. And in each of those elections, what you would call the left, traditional left of Israeli politics, has been moved from being the official opposition to really becoming a minority party in a potentially governing bloc that can only take office if the Benny Gantz-led Blue and White Party is able to form the government. If the Likud and the right-wing bloc that supports Benjamin Netanyahu is able to form a government, then the left of Israeli politics will find itself outside of government for yet another term. And it's now coming close to 10 years, maybe more than that, since there has been a strong left-wing presence within the Israeli government. Now, within our own community as well, there, of course, we have a split between right and left, but there does seem to be a consensus around the centre and left, which is in support of there being a two-state solution. But the political drift now, as you can see in Israel, with Benjamin Netanyahu campaigning on policies of annexing part of the West Bank, with the American president, the American administration coming forward with a deal that heavily favors Israel and its territorial claims in relation to its relations with the Palestinians, and which makes the prospect of a negotiated agreement with the Palestinians subject to a huge number of conditions before it can happen. What I find is that this leaves a problem for liberal or left-wing Zionism, because there is a drift to the right. And this drift to the right means that what I believe in relation to the San Remo Declaration, which is it merely is a step along the road to there being the modern political status of the State of Israel, has actually become quite a major point for celebration by the right wing, by the Greater Israel, and by those who some of the right wing lawyers who advocate the rights that Israel has over the land, including Palestinian land, is cemented in international law. And for them, the San Remo Declaration is a very useful retort, because you hear an awful lot about how settlements of Israel within the West Bank are illegal under international law. There is a movement, a legal movement, which is using the San Remo Declaration to counter this argument and to create an argument that actually the Jewish title, Israeli title, over the West Bank and Jerusalem is itself grounded in international law. And they use this to counter the arguments that the settlements are illegal under international law. So you can see the complexity of all of this, and how the San Remo Declaration is now being used as a legal argument as part of this. So I'm going to finish with a couple of things and then throw it open to discussion and questions, because I've long been concerned about what impact this is going to have on Zionism and the Zionist consensus within the UK. You've already seen, I think, amongst younger people, a sympathy towards what I describe as more left-wing approaches to Zionism, supportive of the two-state solution, supportive of agreement with Palestinians, and increasingly critical of Israeli government policy towards Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in relation to settlements, and so on. In fact, the controversy over the Kaddish for Gaza last year and the subsequent establishment of new youth movements to support the people who did that shows that there is quite a strong feeling amongst younger people who, even though they are Zionists and they believe in the State of Israel, its right to defend itself, are actually becoming more active in campaigning for there being an agreement and accommodation with the Palestinians, and are becoming quite critical of Israel, of steps that it takes that make that agreement with the Palestinians less likely. So what has concerned me for a while is that the Zionist consensus, which has been based around a two-state solution and an agreement with the Palestinians, is just beginning to fracture, and that there are people moving to the left who are becoming more critical of Israel and Israeli political policies, and there is a political move to the right motivated by the government of Israel and the American government that moves towards more of that Greater Israel, Israeli unilateralist type approach that I think is going to create a threat to our consensus within British Jewish community around the two-state solution. So I'm just going to finish my presentation and then throw open for discussion and questions with some messages from 100 years ago that might be able to apply today to this tricky situation. I want to go to Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was writing not about Israel a long time ago, but who Chief Rabbi Hertz, when he wrote his letter 100 years ago in support of the Balfour Declaration, quoted. And he quoted from the Sedra of Kedoshim, and he quotes a paragraph from Kedoshim that underpins the moral and political message that the chief rabbi 100 years ago was trying to send to the British government relating to relations between the Jews and the Arabs. He says as follows: the guiding principle of the legal constitution for your own land is to be that all inhabitants of the land, native born and stranger alike, are equal before the law. Holiness of life in mind and deed demands something more. You must accord the stranger full equality with your native born brother. The respect and love that you give to the stranger is the true test of your fear and love of Hashem. Now, this quote by Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch on the Parsha of Kedoshim was fully adopted by the chief rabbi in his letter to the government. Chief Rabbi took two verses from a Parsha that deals with holiness to indicate to the government that in his intention, the Jewish home would be a model of equality and holiness. And the test was how it treated the Arabs. He was sending a very moral and political message. And he was not the only one. I'm going to put the final word of my presentation to the chief administrator of Palestine after the San Remo conference. He read the following statement: the Supreme Council has decided upon the mandate for Palestine, and that Mr. Balfour's declaration regarding a Jewish national home is to be included in the Turkish peace treaty. The inclusion of Mr. Balfour's declaration in the treaty means that there will be no interference with the religious customs or the holy places or any curtailment whatever of the religious liberty of the subject, but only the maintenance of public order and security. Immigrants will be allowed to enter only as required for the development of the country, and immigration will be controlled by the British government. The decision has at last been given, and henceforward there must be an end to political strife and unrest. All true Palestinians must now strive with one another in healthy rivalry to the good of Palestine and the welfare of future generations. He said that in April 1920, and I'm afraid that we're still waiting, and that the way that this declaration is being remembered indicates that that wish may be some way further off. That's what I want to say. I'm now very happy to open this up to questions. I can see all of you. And so if you want to ask something, what you have to do is unmute yourself and come on with a question. I'm now going to move to the chat function. If you do have the chat function and you want to ask a question and you don't want to shout out, please just write your name in there and I'll go to you. So if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, we've got 10 minutes for that, and I can see everybody. So I don't know who wants to go first. I'm seeing nobody yet has come through. Feel free to shout. You have to unmute yourself. I can see a comment from Carolyn. I can see a comment from Rabbi Nick Batcher. Nobody yet saying that they want to make a comment. You're perfectly entitled, of course, to disagree with every single word I've said, particularly from where I got editorial on all of this. No one else. Is my wife Joanna wants to say something.
I think you show that you're quite left-wing in your politics, Simon. Can you comment on that?
So the question I had is, I show that I've shown in this that I am quite left-wing in my politics. And so the answer to that is yes. If I were in Israel, I would vote for the left. But I'm also a British Jewish communal leader, and therefore my personal views are irrelevant. I try and hold a central line. My aim is to try and hold the centre ground, because I believe that's the role of Jewish communal leaders, to try and maintain the Zionist consensus as widely as you can for as long as possible. And I think that's becoming a little bit more difficult now with this drift to the right that there is in Israeli politics and in American politics. And I think what's moved it more than anything else is the policy of the United States, the current United States administration, which I think by any analysis has been more supportive of the types of territorial arguments and relations with the Palestinians that have been favored by the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. See if anybody else wants to ask a question. Feel free to just jump in if you want to. I can see that not everybody is working out how to use the chat function. If anybody wants to ask, feel free to jump in. I'll be able to see who it is.
Hi, Simon. Am I right to ask a question?
Yeah, Edward.
Hi, Simon. It's Edward Isaacs. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, do you not think the significance of the San Remo conference could be seen to be quite limited, given that at the time at which it was passed, the British government viewed the Jewish people who wanted to establish a Jewish state as one, obviously being desperate, given that the circumstances for Jewish people in Europe at the time was fairly deteriorating, and that actually they kind of viewed it as almost a means to expand their own empire, given that the Jewish people could be seen as fairly friendly and cooperative, given that they were the ones who really wanted to establish their own state. And then there's actually only after the Holocaust that really you see the real impetus and actually that significant moment where internationally it's recognised that the Jewish people should then be accorded, given that they're their own states, for their own protection per se.
Thank you, Edward. So Edward's question was something like, was the San Remo Declaration more motivated by imperial claims of the various nations, and that its significance now it might be less, and that actually the moves towards the State of Israel were probably motivated by the aftermath of the Holocaust more than anything else? Look, there is no question that the San Remo Declaration was at the time binding in international law. The question is whether international law agreed in 1920 is still binding in 2020. I think that's a very, very interesting question. There's no doubt, listening to all that political shenanigans that I talked about, it was all about imperial rights. Which empire was going to operate what was effectively a carve-up of the Ottoman Empire? And great attention, of course, was given to the oil fields of Mesopotamia. And there was, for the British, although they were very supportive of Zionist arguments, the Lloyd George government was quite religious, quite believing in the biblical rights of the Jewish people. They were quite significant on that. But remember, they also wanted to control the oil fields near Basra, and they wanted to be able to control the port at Haifa and to establish a train line that would allow land to flow through entirely British-controlled land so that they could get oil out. So there were imperial and political issues that were around at the time. So there's no question that the Zionists got what they wanted in 1920, and it had legal effect. But there were imperial motives to enable it to happen at the same time as well. And yes, the real international consensus between the establishment of a state of Israel came from the partition agreement in 1947 and the 1948 UN resolution, which who knows whether it would have happened or not, was based on the Holocaust. I've had a couple of questions come through on chat. One from Simon Morris. Would I care to speculate how and from where the next breakthrough might come towards a viable long-term solution? Well, I mean, this is where I'm not going to hold myself out as a political commentator, but at the moment, the only deal that is out there is the so-called deal of the century put forward by the American administration. The deal of the century, I would have thought that it would not have had quite the sympathetic hearing that it has had. I was very surprised, actually, at how warmly the European Union nations and the British government reacted to it. Not saying we agree with it, but saying, look, everybody should get around the table and discuss on the basis of this. Quite interesting, given how quickly the Palestinians rejected it. And I think that the argument, what I think that Netanyahu and the Israeli government and the Americans are banking on, is that the other Arab countries now, for other reasons, are going to be more supportive of finding a comprehensive solution around the Middle East than a pure bespoke negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. And you know, that for me is that at the moment is the only deal that's out there. And whilst it looks as though the current American administration is going to secure another term, whilst we are not sure who's going to be the Prime Minister of Israel, it doesn't look as though if it is Benny Gantz on the blue and white side, they're going to take a radically different position from Netanyahu on security in the West Bank. So that seems to be the only game in town at the moment. That doesn't mean it's the only game in town forever, but it's certainly the only one at the moment, and it doesn't seem to have much chance. I've had a question from Edwin Birnbaum. Doesn't the UN partition plan cancel the San Remo agreement in view of land rights? Well, I have to say that's what I think, but it's not what the lawyers who advocate for the San Remo declaration think. They think that the San Remo conference is a declaration is legally binding and has not been contradicted or countermanded by anything that has come through from the League of Nations or the United Nations since. So that's their argument. A question from Gideon Smith. Any thoughts how we manage our broad church given different people's focus on legal security and the human rights aspect of the conflict? Does it matter if the community fractures on these dimensions? Well, that's a good question, Gid. I think it does matter if the community fractures, because I think we have held a consensus together for quite a long time based around the two-state solution. So I think the only way that we can maintain that consensus is by trying to maintain at least the outlying principles of a two-state solution, which is that there should eventually be a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. And as long as that remains the basis of the consensus, then we've got a chance of holding it together. Now, you've asked the right question. Any two states or the two-state solution? To be honest, I've always thought that whatever we think, whatever anybody else thinks, assuming that there is ever an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab nations, whatever that agreement is, that will be the consensus. But whilst there is no agreement between them, we have to have something to work with. And the only sort of treaty, the only sort of proposal that's out there before the deal of the century from Trump was the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution. So I think we have to try and hold that consensus together, because the thing that worries me is that consensus around the two-state solution from the Oslo Accords is the basis for the political support for Israel that we have when Israel has to defend itself. And once everybody has abandoned that, I think it's quite difficult to rebuild that consensus with some of the parts of the political establishment. Right, it is 11:45. It was 1 hour. We need to go back into shul now to hear the rabbi's sermon, and for the rest of it, I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for being with us. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. Hampton Garden Suburb Shul has recorded this, so it might appear online if you want to catch up. You may not have agreed with everything I've said, but I hope you found it interesting. And more important than anything else, I hope that you all manage to stay safe, stay well, and a reminder that if you need anything, the Hampstead Garden Suburb Shul has the ability to have volunteers to go and get things for you. We're running the Nefesh network. There's a whole range of services being offered through the shul, so keep an eye on the news sheet on the Facebook page of the Hampstead Garden Suburb Shul. And thank you very, very much indeed to everybody for being part of it. That was Coffee and Conversation, and I'm going to dial off. David, feel free to end the meeting. Thank you.